Rome didn't end every war with victory. Sometimes it paid. Somewhere in the East, at the height of its power, the Roman Empire did something unthinkable. It handed gold to its greatest enemy just to make the fighting stop. Not as a trick, not as a delay, but as a decision. No triumph, no celebration, just a quiet agreement and a long shadow. Because Rome wasn't supposed to do this, not to anyone. So what happened? Why would an emperor choose payment over pride? And more unsettling, did that single choice save the empire or quietly reveal that it was already changing? Rome in the mid-3rd century didn't feel like the empire people imagined. It looked powerful on maps, vast, stretching from Britain to the Middle East, but on the ground, it was fraying. Emperors came and went with uncomfortable speed. Some ruled for years, others barely lasted months. Armies were loyal, but not always to Rome, often to the man who paid them. The borders told the real story. Along the Rhine and Danube, pressure never stopped. Raids, invasions, constant testing. And in the east, something more organized was rising. The Sasanian Empire under Shapur I wasn't just another rival. It was disciplined, ambitious, and very aware that Rome was no longer untouchable. This wasn't the Rome of easy victories. This was a Rome reacting, stretching its resources, moving legions from one crisis to another, hoping nothing collapsed all at once. And that was the problem. You inherit them. And somewhere in that unstable world, a new emperor was about to step into power, not at a moment of strength, but in the middle of a situation already slipping out of control. Marcus Aurelius Philippus didn't look like the kind of man Rome usually trusted with everything. He wasn't from Rome's old aristocracy. He came from Arabia, far from where emperors were supposed to come from. To some, that already made him an outsider. But the empire he stepped into didn't have the luxury of being selective. Philip rose the way many did in this era, through the military. Quietly, steadily, without much spectacle. He learned how to navigate command, loyalty, and timing. Not a conqueror, not a legend, just someone who knew how to survive a system that kept breaking itself. And survival, at this point in Roman history, was its own kind of skill. He wasn't the obvious choice for emperor, which is exactly why he fit the moment. Because this wasn't a time for ideal rulers or heroic figures. It was a time for men who could step into chaos and hold it together, at least for a while. Still, even for someone like Philip, the situation waiting for him wasn't something you could ease into. It was already in motion. The war in the East didn't pause just because Rome needed a breather. It pressed on. Emperor Gordian III was already deep in Persian territory, leading a campaign against Shapur I. At first, things seemed manageable. The Roman army was intact, disciplined, still carrying the weight of its reputation. Then something shifted. Somewhere along the campaign, near the front, far from Rome, Gordian III died. Not in a clear, glorious last stand. The details are murky, ancient sources don't agree, and that silence leaves room for uncomfortable questions. In the middle of enemy territory, with no time for stability or ceremony, power changed hands. Philip stepped forward and was declared emperor. No celebration, no secure transition, just a new ruler standing in a dangerous place, holding an army that needed direction, and quickly. Because this wasn't a controlled situation. Rome's forces were exposed, supplies were uncertain, the enemy was close, organized, and watching. Philip didn't inherit a throne. He inherited a problem that was already unfolding, already demanding a decision that couldn't be delayed. Philip didn't have the luxury of a perfect move. He had an army deep in enemy territory, a new title that hadn't settled yet, and a war that could still turn against him. So instead of pushing forward, he stopped. Negotiations began. Not the kind of negotiation Rome was used to. There was no demand for total submission, no long list of Roman terms. This time, the balance wasn't in its favor. Shapur I held his ground, and Philip chose to meet him there. A deal was made. Rome would withdraw safely. The war would end, and in return, a large payment would be handed over. Gold, resources, something valuable enough to secure peace. No victory parade, no conquered enemy. Just distance from a situation that could have gone very wrong. It worked, at least on the surface. The army lived. The emperor returned. But something didn't sit right. Something shifted. Because Rome didn't usually pay to end wars. It dictated how they ended. And even if this decision made sense in that moment, it left behind a quiet question. What does it mean when an empire chooses to negotiate like this? Back in Rome, the crisis didn't look like a crisis anymore. Philip arrived not as a desperate commander from a fragile front, but as an emperor in control. And he moved quickly to shape that image. If the East had been uncertain, Rome itself needed to feel stable. So he gave it something familiar. In 448 CE, the empire celebrated its 1000th year, a milestone heavy with symbolism. Games were held on a massive scale, gladiators, wild animals, spectacles that reminded people of what Rome was supposed to be, eternal, unshaken, larger than any single problem. For a moment, it worked. The city was distracted. The narrative shifted. Instead of a quiet peace in the East, people saw strength, continuity, tradition. Philip didn't just return, he performed stability. But the empire beyond the celebrations didn't follow the script. On the frontiers, pressure hadn't disappeared. Along the Danube in the east, the same tensions remained, waiting. Armies still needed pay. Commanders still watched each other carefully. Loyalty, as always, had conditions. And then there was the part no festival could cover. That decision in the east. Even if it was practical, even if it saved lives, it changed how Rome was perceived. Not overnight, not in a way people openly declared, but quietly in how enemies calculated and how soldiers thought. Because once an empire shows it's willing to pay to end a war, the question lingers, what else might it concede? On the surface, everything looked intact. Underneath, the change was subtle, but it lingered. And the next challenge wouldn't come from across the border, it would come from within. The first cracks didn't look like collapse. They looked like routine problems. Another restless province, another commander needing to be reminded who was in charge. Rome had seen this before. It knew how to respond. Or at least it thought it did. Revolts began to surface, scattered at first. Names of new claimants, local uprisings, soldiers backing their own leaders. Nothing unusual for this period, but frequency has a way of turning noise into a pattern. Philip couldn't ignore it. So he did what emperors often did. He sent a trusted general to restore order. His name was Decius. Capable, respected, the kind of man who could stabilize a situation without drawing too much attention to himself. That was the idea. But armies in this era didn't just follow orders, they made decisions. Somewhere along the Danube, Decius's troops did something familiar and dangerous. They proclaimed him emperor. Just like that, the problem changed. This wasn't a rebellion anymore. It was a rival. And once that line is crossed, there's no quiet way back. Philip had held the empire together through negotiation, through image, through careful balance. But this kind of challenge doesn't respond to balance. It demands a side. So he marched. Two Roman forces, led by two Roman emperors, moving toward each other, not because of foreign invasion, not because of external pressure, but because the system itself kept producing these moments. They met near Verona in 249 CE. The outcome wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Philip was defeated, killed in the aftermath. No long decline in that moment, no gradual unraveling. Just a decision, a confrontation, and the end of his rule as quickly as it had begun. There wasn't much time for reflection. After Philip fell, the shift was immediate. His son, still in Rome, still holding the title of co-emperor, was killed soon after. Quietly, efficiently. Another loose end tied off. Decius took control. Another emperor, another attempt to stabilize something that refused to stay still. And the crisis didn't end. The borders were still under pressure. The armies were still decisive. The pattern, rise, rule, replacement, kept repeating. Philip's fall didn't solve anything. It just made space for the next turn. Which makes his story harder to pin down, because that decision in the East, the one that ended a war without victory, it wasn't clearly a mistake. In that moment, it likely saved an army. It may have bought Rome time it genuinely needed. But it also revealed something, not weakness, something quieter, a shift. Rome was no longer choosing between victory and defeat. Sometimes it was choosing between survival and something that looked uncomfortably close to compromise. And maybe that's the part that lingers. Not that an emperor paid an enemy, but that, for the first time, it made sense to.